October 28, 1943. 5:15 in the afternoon. The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, Pennsylvania. A heavy fog rolled in off the Delaware River, thick and unnatural, clinging to the hull of a single destroyer escort docked at Pier 12. Workers on the docks would later say the air itself felt wrong that evening, charged with a low electrical hum that made the hair on their arms stand on end. The ship was the USS Eldridge, a vessel that had only recently been commissioned, and yet it had already been selected for something no naval officer would ever speak of on the record. Inside the restricted zone surrounding the pier, armed guards stood at intervals, their orders simple and absolute. No civilian, no journalist, no unauthorized personnel was to come within 500 yards of the operation. Above them, on a raised platform overlooking the dock, Lieutenant Commander James Harding watched through binoculars as a team of engineers made final adjustments to a series of massive degaussing coils wrapped around the Eldridge hull. These coils, officially, were part of a routine demagnetization process designed to protect ships from German magnetic mines. Unofficially, according to the men who would later break their silence, the coils were something else entirely. They were the physical manifestation of a theory that had been quietly circulating through certain corridors of American science for years, a theory rooted in the unfinished work of Albert Einstein himself, who had spent the better part of 2 decades chasing what he called a unified field theory, a single mathematical framework capable of binding gravity and electromagnetism into one elegant equation. Einstein never completed that theory in any form the public ever saw. But rumors persisted for decades that fragments of his research, deemed too volatile or too incomplete for publication, had been quietly handed over to naval intelligence under the umbrella of wartime cooperation. Whether Einstein himself was ever physically present at the Philadelphia shipyard remains one of the most contested questions in the entire affair, but what cannot be disputed is that his theoretical work formed the philosophical backbone of what the Navy was allegedly attempting that October evening: to bend electromagnetic fields around a physical object so completely that the object would become invisible to radar, and according to the most extreme accounts, invisible to the human eye itself. At 5:20 in the afternoon, the generators powering the coils were switched on. Witnesses on nearby vessels described a greenish haze beginning to form around the Eldridge hull, thickening within minutes into a fog so dense that the ship's outline blurred, then dissolved entirely from view. For several minutes, by multiple accounts later collected by independent researchers, the space where the USS Eldridge had been docked appeared to contain nothing but empty water and a faint depression in the haze where the vessel's silhouette had once stood. Dock workers reported a sensation of nausea, a metallic taste in the air, and an overwhelming pressure in their ears, as though the atmosphere itself had been compressed. Lieutenant Commander Harding, watching from the platform, would later be quoted in classified Navy correspondence that surfaced decades later through Freedom of Information Act requests, describing the event only in the most clinical terms, refusing to confirm or deny what civilian witnesses claimed to have seen. But it was Carl Allen, a merchant sailor stationed aboard a nearby vessel that night, who would become the single most consequential witness in the entire mythology of the Philadelphia experiment. Allen claimed to have watched the Eldridge vanish completely from the Philadelphia dock, only to reappear, by his account, in the waters off Norfolk, Virginia, over 200 miles away, for a duration of several minutes, before vanishing again and rematerializing back at its original berth in Philadelphia. It was an account so extraordinary, so far beyond the boundaries of known physics, that for years it was dismissed outright by mainstream historians as the fevered imagination of a troubled man. And Carl Allen was, by every account, a troubled man. Following his discharge from the Merchant Marine, Carl Allen drifted from job to job, struggling with what friends and family later described as severe psychological instability. He began writing letters in the early 1950s to a civilian physicist named Morris K. Jessup, who had recently published a book exploring unconventional theories of propulsion and gravity. Allen's letters, scrawled in erratic handwriting and filled with strange capitalizations and underlines, described not only the disappearance of the Eldridge but horrifying secondary effects allegedly suffered by the crew. According to Allen, several sailors aboard the ship during the experiment were left permanently changed. Some fused partially into the metal bulkheads of the vessel itself. Their bodies merged with steel in ways that defied medical explanation. Others, he claimed, suffered a condition the crew began calling getting stuck, a phenomenon in which a man would simply freeze mid-motion, sometimes for hours, trapped between one moment and the next as though time itself had stuttered around him. Still others were said to have gone permanently insane, institutionalized under classified Navy custody, their records sealed and their families told only that their sons had died in the line of duty. Jessup, intrigued and disturbed by the letters, began corresponding with Allen directly, eventually incorporating fragments of his claims into later editions of his work. It was this collaboration that brought the Philadelphia experiment out of the shadows of naval rumor and into the public consciousness for the first time, setting off a chain of events that would draw the attention of the United States Navy itself, an institution that has, to this day, never fully closed the book on what happened at Pier 12 in October of 1943. In 1956, a package arrived at the Office of Naval Research addressed to a contact who had reportedly read Jessup's book. The package contained an annotated copy of the publication, its margins filled with handwritten notes from 3 distinct authors, each claiming first-hand knowledge of extraterrestrial races and clandestine government technology. The annotations reference names, dates, and technical descriptions so unusual that 2 Navy officers, Captain Sidney Sherby and Commander George Hoover, took the unusual step of having the annotated book privately reprinted and distributed in a limited run, an act that, intentionally or not, lent an air of official credibility to claims the Navy would later insist were nothing more than elaborate hoaxes. Morris Jessup himself grew increasingly paranoid in the years following his correspondence with Allen, reportedly becoming convinced that he was being surveilled, his phone tapped, his movements tracked by men he believed were connected to whatever organization had been responsible for the Philadelphia experiment. In April of 1959, Jessup was found dead in his car in a Florida park, a length of hose connecting the exhaust pipe to the interior of the vehicle. Official investigators ruled the death a suicide, citing his documented struggles with depression and financial hardship. But to researchers who had followed his work, the timing and circumstances of his death only deepened the sense that something genuinely classified, genuinely dangerous, had been touched upon in his investigation of Carl Allen's claims. Decades later, declassified documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests confirmed at least the skeletal framework of the official story, that the USS Eldridge did exist, that it was indeed present at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in October of 1943, and that experimental degaussing technology was, in fact, being tested on naval vessels during that period as a legitimate countermeasure against German magnetic mines. What the documents do not confirm, and what the Navy has consistently and categorically denied, is that any aspect of the experiment involved invisibility, teleportation, or the catastrophic physical effects described by Carl Allen. Naval historians point to ship deck logs showing the Eldridge was, according to official records, in New York Harbor on the exact date Allen claimed it vanished from Philadelphia, a discrepancy that skeptics argue definitively disproves the entire account. And yet the deck logs themselves have been challenged by independent researchers who note inconsistencies in their documentation, missing pages, and unusual gaps in the chain of custody for naval records from that period, gaps that, while common across wartime documentation generally, take on a different weight when placed against the backdrop of a story this strange. What makes the Philadelphia experiment endure, even in the face of official denial, is not merely Carl Allen's testimony but the broader context of American military research during the Second World War, a period in which the United States government was, by its own later admissions, engaged in genuinely radical and ethically questionable scientific programs. The Manhattan Project itself, the effort that produced the atomic bomb, was conducted under a level of secrecy so absolute that even Vice President Harry Truman was kept largely uninformed of its existence until he assumed the presidency following Franklin Roosevelt's death in April of 1945. If the United States government was capable of hiding a program as vast and consequential as the development of nuclear weapons from its own elected leadership, the argument goes, then the concealment of a smaller, more contained naval experiment involving electromagnetic theory becomes, if not proven, at least plausible within the broader pattern of wartime secrecy. Researchers who have spent years investigating the Philadelphia experiment point to figures like Nikola Tesla, who died in January of 1943, just months before the alleged experiment took place, and whose research papers were seized by the federal government within hours of his death under the authority of the Office of Alien Property. Tesla's work on resonance, electromagnetic fields, and wireless energy transmission has fueled decades of speculation that fragments of his unpublished research, much like the rumored fragments of Einstein's unified field theory, found their way into classified naval projects during the war. Projects whose full scope may never be publicly known given the scale of documentation that remains classified to this day under national security provisions. By the late 1970s, the Philadelphia experiment had transformed from an obscure naval rumor into a full-fledged cultural phenomenon, inspiring books, documentaries, and eventually a 1984 feature film that dramatized the story for mainstream audiences, cementing it permanently into American pop culture and conspiracy folklore. The Navy's official position, reiterated consistently across decades and multiple administrations, remains unchanged. No such experiment ever took place. The claims originated from a single emotionally unstable individual, and the entire affair represents nothing more than an elaborate piece of wartime mythology that spiraled beyond control. Yet former Navy personnel who served during the relevant period have, in subsequent interviews conducted by independent researchers, offered accounts that neither confirm nor fully deny the existence of classified experiments involving electromagnetic camouflage technology, often citing oaths of secrecy that, in their telling, remain binding regardless of how many decades have passed since the war's end. This pattern, official denial paired with ambiguous testimony from those closest to the source, has become the defining characteristic of the Philadelphia experiment as a historical mystery, a story that exists in the liminal space between documented fact and unverifiable legend, neither fully proven nor definitively disproven, kept alive by the simple fact that absolute certainty, in either direction, has never been achieved. What remains beyond dispute is the human cost embedded within the legend itself, regardless of whether the most extreme claims hold any literal truth. Carl Allen died in 1994, having spent the final decades of his life in obscurity, his claims neither vindicated nor entirely dismissed by the historical record. Morris Jessup's death continues to be cited by researchers as one of the more troubling unresolved threads in the broader story, a death that, whatever its true cause, occurred in direct connection to his investigation of a classified naval program. And the USS Eldridge itself, the vessel at the center of the entire mythology, was eventually transferred to the Greek Navy in 1951, renamed the Leon, and served an active duty for decades before being decommissioned and ultimately scrapped in 1999, taking with it any physical evidence that might have definitively settled the question one way or another. What the Philadelphia experiment ultimately represents, beyond the specifics of teleportation and invisibility, is a deeper and more unsettling truth about the relationship between the American government and its citizens during periods of extreme wartime secrecy, a truth in which official denial and documented historical gaps coexist so closely that the line between conspiracy and concealment becomes nearly impossible to locate. The fog that rolled over the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard on October 28, 1943, may have lifted within hours, but the questions it left behind have never fully cleared, drifting instead through 8 decades of classified files, contested testimony, and a government that has never quite said enough to put the matter to rest, nor little enough to make the world stop asking. What do you think? Share your theory in the comments. And for more such mysterious stories of history, subscribe to Dustvale History. Also, watch our other video. There is also such an unknown history waiting there.